Hello, and welcome once again to the people who were here before and to our new visitors. My name is Pat Esgate. I am the organizer of Ann Lister Birthday Weekend, which was supposed to have been held in Halifax this weekend, ALBW 2020. Unfortunately, it was canceled. We have rescheduled for next year. You'll be hearing a little bit more about that. It'll be April 11th through the 18th, and we're looking forward to seeing everybody there. But like Miss Lister, we rise above it. And due to the absolute generosity of all of our speakers, we have been able to create for you this live stream event that goes over 3 days. And it's not just the generosity of our speakers, but through the incredibly hard work of the two tech people that are behind the screen here, Livia Labate and Steph Galloway. I want to thank the two of you so much. You're just doing such a fantastic job this week. And also, of course, my co-organizers, Cheryl McDonald and Jennifer Grant. Now, we have been fortunate enough to have with us this afternoon and this evening Dr. Jill Liddington, who I'm absolutely delighted to welcome here to ALBW Live. Jill, as most of us know, is the author of Female Fortune, the book that inspired Gentleman Jack. And run out and buy it today, please. And so, Jill, welcome to ALBW Live. We've talked a lot this week as we've both been stuck away in our homes due to the epidemic, the pandemic that's out there now. But Ann Lister lived through an epidemic of her own, didn't she?
She really did. She lived through a cholera epidemic, 1831-32. And just to give you an idea of the dimensions of it, Mrs. Norcliffe wrote to her from about York that there are 127 deaths in York. There are 127 deaths in the city of York. And she says, Mrs. Norcliffe, it included the most respectable sort, booksellers and choristers in the Minster, etc., etc. And I've just checked the coronavirus figures for the city of York now, and it's 36 cases. That's 36 cases. We don't know how many deaths, but obviously a very small number. Right. 127 in 1832. So what did Ann Lister do? Because she was, if ever, a survivor. She was quite happy to do social distancing. She walked on her own. She walked 2 or 3 times every day. She didn't do self-isolating. She did not want to stay indoors. So she was staying with Vere Hobart at the end of 1831 in Hastings, which was a fairly healthy country place, she said, and walked out every day. And she wrote to her aunt at Shibden and said, luckily her aunt was tucked away in Shibden, just outside urban Halifax, and so was safe. So Ann Lister survived this terrible cholera epidemic, and through a lot of energy. And out of the cholera epidemic, a few decades later, came some wonderful public health reforms that meant everybody got fresh water and everybody got sewage properly drained away, and nobody needed to fear the plague again. So,
well, I do have to say that I hope that kind of good thing comes out following this pandemic, especially in the United States, where, as most of us here know, we don't have anything that meets up with your National Health Service.
No, I know.
And it is something us on the blue side that we're working very hard to get. So
good luck.
Thank you. So Jill, Ann Lister really was laid quiet for many, many years. We didn't see historians taking her on. There wasn't a lot of, there weren't any publications about her, etc. There were some very important reasons for this, not the least of which was the criminalization of male homosexuality, correct?
Very much so, and it was the criminal law against male homosexual activity was made harsher in 1885 with harsher penalties, And that really affected people like John Lister, for example, who was the first wonderful person to transcribe the Anne Lister Diaries. And he had this fantastic series of weekly articles in the Halifax Guardian from 1887 to 1892 on the social and political life of Halifax. But of course, it was all based on the handwritten diaries, and he hadn't at that stage cracked Anne Lister's impenetrable code.
It would have been interesting to talk to him about what he thought about might be in there, right? The secrets of the code, but he did find it. But even with the sort of cloud that sat over that, there were historians that did finally go to work on Anne Lister. And you are a direct link back to those people. I'd like for you to speak a little bit about a couple of them. First of all, Muriel Green. I know you have some direct ties to Muriel. I'd love to hear about that.
Yes, well, that's right, Pat. I began my work as a feminist historian interested in the history of women back in the 1970s. And I began my work on votes for women. What was the history of women winning the right to vote? And it was still possible in the mid-1970s to go and interview the daughters, elderly daughters of suffragists. So I took my tiny little creaky cassette recorder along to those houses and interviewed elderly women about what it was like to have a mother who was constantly campaigning. And with Anne Lister, because she died in 1840, the opportunities for oral history were somewhat limited. I looked around, but I couldn't really find anybody much other than Muriel Green. And Muriel Green was a very interesting person. Would you like me to say a little bit about her?
I absolutely would, yes. Who was she?
She was the daughter of the Halifax Borough librarian. At that stage, then in the 1930s, quite an important position. And John Lister, who we know cracked the code, Anne Lister Code, had died in 1933. And Shibden Hall, now a museum, was then owned by Halifax Borough. So it fell to Muriel Green's father, Edward Green, to go into Shibden Hall and look at all the manuscript material that was there. His daughter, Muriel Green, then I think aged about 19, went in with him. And she said to me in my interview with her, which I did in 1991 in North London, I took along my little cassette recorder. I said, what was it like, Muriel, going into Shibden Hall just after John Lister had died? And she said it was chaos. It was papers overflowing absolutely everywhere. And there was a live-in constable making sure there was no burglaries. So she started working through the papers, the Anne Lister papers, of which there are so many.
Wow, and she was working on them out at Shibden Hall then?
She was sitting in Shibden Hall for a number of years. I think it took her, I'm trying to remember the exact details, something like a couple of years to go through all the letters. And of course, at that stage, she didn't have access to the code to the diary, how the code was cracked. But I did ask her about it, and she was quite elderly. She was in her late 80s.
Just so for the people that are listening, Jill's interview with Muriel Green is on her website in the publication section, so you can actually listen to that. It's quite
audiovisual. Yeah, this is a letter that she wrote to me after the interview in 1991. So this is 1992, and it's very helpful sometimes that people are forgetful because she's forgotten what she's told me in the interview a year ago. Dear Jill, from Highgate in North London. She says, I remember my father telling me he had a letter about 1936 from, I think, an Antiquarian Society friend, Halifax Antiquarian Society friend of John Lister, who said they had cracked the code in Anne Lister's diary. And would he, Edward Green, her father, like a copy of it? Now, librarians, borough librarians don't normally do wild enthusiasm, but Edward Green did. And of course, my father said, yes, please, double exclamation marks. I believe this correspondence is in the Calderdale archives. I don't remember the name of the correspondent, or that it was a long time ago, as 1980, that they cracked the code. So I'm puzzled. 1991 in the interview, 1992 getting this letter. Who was this person who had written to her father, who had cracked the code? So I took this letter, this is my memory, into the archives in 1992, and we were lucky enough in the small Calderdale archives, local archives in Halifax, to have an excellent archivist called Dr. Alan Betteridge. And he heard my woes. Who is this man who helped John Lister crack the code? Where is this letter? And as a professional archivist, he went to, I guess, the borough librarian's correspondence file, which I'm sure was voluminous and full of stuff about, can we have an increase in the library budget for next year, and which books are missing in the local libraries. And he found these two letters, 1936, 1937, from a man called Arthur Burrell, a classics scholar teaching at Bradford Library, which explained how he and John Lister had cracked the code very late at night at Shibden around 1892, and sending a copy of the key to the code to Edward Green, Muriel's father. And I thought, wow, when I came across that letter, which Alan Betteridge had helpfully reclassified from the library archives to the Shibden manuscripts, I just went, wow, nobody knew this. People were very vague up to 1992 as to when the code was cracked and how.
Wow. And, there's a couple of things about that are interesting. Well, there's a lot about it that's interesting, but I know that Arthur Burrell wanted to burn the diaries. So it's interesting to me that he then took the time and the effort to send this letter to Muriel Green's father.
Well, I think the key episode, the key change, is the death of John Lister. John Lister dying in 1933, the absolutely last of the Listers. Nobody could possibly find any descendants. And what is pertinent to this and to this hitherto mystery is that John Lister was very probably homosexual himself. There's no documentary evidence of that, of course there isn't, but there's hearsay, anecdotal evidence. Right. And people had a lot of respect for John Lister, not just that he was the last Lister to inherit and inhabit Shibden Hall, but he was such a decent man and had such a terrible time with the criminalization of male homosexuality. And if you go to Shibden and look at the photograph there of the antiquarians, John Lister, they all look solemn. He looks utterly despondent, and it was not a good time to be gay in Britain. And I think the death of John Lister was, for Arthur Burrell and possibly others, a little bit of an opening of the door that had been closed back in 1892. So a couple of years later, yes, Arthur Burrell could write to Edward Green from London, where he'd moved to, and say, here is the key to the code. But what he instructed Edward Green to do, he said, this is incendiary stuff. I am going to burn, and he was quite elderly then, I am going to burn my key to the code, so you will then have the only key to the Anne Lister diary code. Will you please place it in the library safe under lock and key? And that's what we understand Edward Green did, and that's where it resided. Wow.
Yes. The other thing that many people may not know about John Lister is that the reason that Shibden Hall wound up in Calderdale's possession is because he spent what was left of the Lister money on social reform causes and union activities, which was completely the opposite from what Anne Lister might have done. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, pretty much so. And Anne Lister is very interesting, the politics of the Lister family, because Anne Lister, as a a member of the landed gentry we're talking about the 1830s, inheriting the ancient Shibden acres, was of course a supporter of the blue interest when it came to elections. She calls it blue, they call it also Tory, we now call it Conservative with a big C.
Right.
A couple of generations elapse and John Lister becomes a progressive Liberal and an elected councillor. And then the Independent Labour Party is formed with Keir Hardie, what's that first name? Keir Hardie as its leader. And John Lister, he's not got much money left, but he's still the owner of Shibden Hall, becomes the treasurer of the Halifax Independent Labour Party, ILP. He's the only man with any money, so of course you have to make him the treasurer. So the politics of these two people were very far apart. Yeah.
Right. And then so he spent what was left of the Lister money, and there was, I don't remember the name of the person, but somebody purchased Shibden Hall from him that gave him a life interest in staying there. He got to stay there until he died.
He could stay there till he died in 1933, and then it fell back to what was Halifax Borough and is now Calderdale.
Right.
Which is great.
Right, which is wonderful. What a wonderful thing to do, because anything could have happened to that place.
Yeah.
Somebody could have bought it and torn it down.
Yeah.
So that was Muriel Green, a fascinating woman, and she was only like 16 years old when she started her research, right?
Yes, she was training to be a librarian. And she plunged in, and she produced this wonderful dissertation in 1938 of the Anne Lister letters, which the diaries are the jewel in the Anne Lister crown, but the letters are things we need to read. So, for example, about cholera or travels, a lot of the detail is in the letters.
Right. So then we go from Muriel Green, and the next person was Phyllis Ramsden.
Yes, Phyllis Ramsden. There was an article in the Guardian in 1984 called "The 2 Million Word Enigma." And it was largely based on an interview with this Anne Lister scholar, herself by then quite elderly, called Phyllis Ramsden. Mm-hmm. And it happened that she died the following year. And what we find in the archives are two things of all her work. We find her summaries of the coded sections of the diaries from the very beginning to the very end, date by date, day by day, just little summaries, a few words of each coded section, and then her essays, Phyllis Ramsden's travel essays. I always felt there was something missing. How come there was no transcripts of the coded sections? How could she know to do the summaries? I mean, anybody who's looked at the coded sections, and a lot of people watching will know that you can't possibly summarize them unless you've actually transcribed them, you've gone letter by letter. And so it's very mysterious. Some people think that Phyllis Ramsden, before she died in 1985, destroyed her transcripts of the coded sections. Other people more recently suggest that after she died, 1985, in her will, she instructed her immediate descendants to burn them. One way or the other, they do not exist, or I do not know that they exist. They're not in the archives that I have seen. And I think what's so absolutely crucial to understand about why there's silence about Anne Lister's diary, which was your initial question, is that even in 1985, in a northern industrial town like Halifax, you couldn't talk about lesbianism. And this was a decade or nearly 2 decades after the 1967 Act, which had decriminalised male homosexuality. And I think that Phyllis Ramsden end piece is very sobering.
Yes, yeah, it is interesting to me that both of them, I know that Muriel, in that recorded interview with you, does make a comment about not wanting to stain the Lister name. And it's obvious from Phyllis Ramsden's acts that she probably felt exactly the same way, to your point. So then we move from Ramsden, and now we've got Helena Whitbread, who has now been working on her book. It's been published. You are now living in Halifax. You're living in Halifax and you're teaching, correct?
Yes, I moved to Halifax in 1980, and I found it quite a conservative small C town, very traditional. So although I didn't know Phyllis Ramsden, I can now understand perfectly. I was beginning to teach for the adult education department at Leeds University, teaching adult students, offering them new opportunities. And I knew about Anne Lister because of the Guardian article in 1984. That had a lot of, people were really interested in that. But I was busy. I was busy teaching my courses, classes for adults for Leeds. And I was going down to Greenham Common, and I was writing the history, the long read to Greenham Common, which Virago published in 1989. So apart from noticing Helena's book, I wasn't doing much work yet.
Jill, because we do have a fairly large American audience here today, as well as other parts of the world, I'd really like it if you could speak just a minute or two about Greenham Common, because it's not a well-known thing anymore. What happened there?
American Air Force wanted to put...
Jill, you have frozen. There you go. If Jill, back up a step, because we lost your audio feed. So the American Air Force had wanted to put a base there. Was that what was going on?
It had a base there, and it wanted to put cruise missiles there. And the peace movement was very active, as was the women's movement. And many of us objected to having cruise missiles sighted in Greenham, Berkshire. And we went down at various occasions to campaign, to demonstrate, to join hands around the wire. So that was what I was doing in the mid-1980s. So I wasn't paying too much attention or had too much time to work on Anne Lister. Right. But around about 1990, all that changed.
Well, I just want to ask one more question about Greenham Common, because it's so amazing. When you talk about joining hands around the wire, am I right in hearing that was a 30-mile thing, that you had people joining hands that entire?
It could have been 30 miles. It didn't feel quite like 30 miles, but it was long.
It was
a lot of women, and I didn't know you were going to ask these questions, so I haven't reminded myself about how many women there were joining hands, embracing the race in, I think, 1983. There's a lot of us went down from Halifax.
It's really a fascinating story, but let's go back to this fascinating story now, and with Anne Lister. So you are in the classroom. Helena Whitbread has published her book, and you have introduced some pages of that book into your class.
Yes, I'm teaching the history module, part of New Opportunities for Women, with a whole group of 22 women students in Halifax. And I'm teaching about Peterloo, 1819, the Reform Act, 1832. So bringing in Anne Lister, Helena's pages into the classroom was quite relevant. And just to show them what a local diarist was writing, and all those women sitting around in the classroom, pens poised, as they started to read, said, well, nobody told us. We never knew anything about this. Why didn't anybody tell us that women or woman a century or so earlier had been able to enjoy freedoms?
Yes. And we've lost the audio feed again for just a second. If we could just be patient. Here we go. Jill, you're back. We're having a little bit of trouble with your audio feed right now, but it's okay. We didn't miss that much of it. So to a woman, they were in your classroom, they all said, in hearing about this Anne Lister living in Halifax,
they all said, well, nobody told us. We didn't know that sort of thing went on around here. They all said, absolutely in unison. And it's absolutely true that Anne Lister was enjoying freedoms in the 1830s that they, in the 1980s, could not dream of. And it had a real impact. And it had an impact on me because at this stage I could at last, having put the Greenham Common history book to bed and Virago working on it and publishing it in 1989, I could now begin to think about Anne Lister. So I got the Guardian article and its heading was the 2 million word enigma. And I thought, well, the Guardian, I mean, really, it's always making mistakes. It even gets its own name wrong. So we used to call it the Growniad because it even got misprints in its own name. So I thought I'm better just go and check that it's perhaps only 1 million or perhaps 500 or whatever words. So I took my pocket calculator and my brain into the archives in Halifax Library. And do you remember microfilm? It was very, very laborious. I'm sitting there like this, and I'm doing words per line, lines per page, pages per volume, volumes in the whole collection. And my little pocket calculator was going fizzing like that with, but whichever way I did the arithmetic, never my strongest suit, whichever way I did the arithmetic, it came out at 3.9 million words, called it 4 million words. And I thought, Growniad, you've got it really wrong. But nobody knew. What it means is the diary is 3 times the length of Samuel Pepys's diary, which we'd always thought was a really, really lengthy diary. So I came out of the Halifax Library, the archives, ashen-faced, absolutely ashen-faced. I thought, what am I going to do?
Well, you obviously decided what you were going to do. So what did you do? What happened next?
Well, I decided, having cooled down a bit, a couple of days to cool down, I decided I couldn't let it go. 4 million words was too enticing, but I needed a research strategy. Mm-hmm. I needed to scope this amazing documentation. So first of all, I began to look at the historiography. That's the history of the Anne Lister diaries, starting with, essentially, with John Lister and his Halifax Guardian, 1887 to 92 articles, which were all about the social and political life in Halifax. Anne Lister doorstepping her tenants at the election time, etc., etc. And then looking at Muriel Green and the letters, and Phyllis Ramsden, and then more recently, Helena Whitbread. And then I decided to drill down into 3 sections of the diary. The earliest diary, which I'd only just discovered, which was 1806 onwards, when Anne Lister was very young, a girl. And then 1819 to see if there was anything about Peterloo, the Peterloo riots of 1819, when people were killed. And there was, very interesting, Anne Lister's take on it. And then 1832. And I decided to stick on 1832 because that, in a sense, I felt was when Anne Lister returned home. She returned home from Hastings. She returned home from being kind of rejected by Vere Hobart and one other woman's conventional marriage plans. She came home despondent to Shibden, and she decided to reinvent herself. She would no longer be just a high society flirt or a European traveller. She would be a woman of great significance, great authority. She would be the inheritor of Shibden's ancient acres, and she would remake herself, and all she needed was a wife.
Right. And what is that? What's that famous Jane Austen quote that you? Well,
I few people write anything better than Jane Austen, so I decided to rewrite Jane Austen. Sorry, Jane. To fit Anne Lister. And this is the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice, 1813, which anybody who knows Jane Austen will have at the back of their minds. Jane Austen adapted for Anne Lister. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. And that's what I pursued from 1832, April, May 1832, Anne Lister coming back home to Shibden, utterly despondent, betrayed by Vere Hobart and her marriage plans. As it were, living Jane Austen's opening sentence, and I must find a wife. And providentially, good fortune, neighbouring heiress, wealthy heiress, lonely, isolated, with none of Anne Lister's excellent academic education, and their estates absolutely adjoining, was young Anne Walker, 12 years younger than Anne Lister, who was very flattered by the scintillating presence and courtship of Anne Lister.
And what a fun thing to run into.
I couldn't believe it, because there was nothing that I'd come across that told me about this courtship. There was Phyllis Ramsden's summaries, but they're really so brief, and often the more interesting they are, the briefer they are. And it'd be interesting whether anybody listening who's looked at the Ramsden summaries would agree with me that it always gets very interesting when Phyllis Ramsden says, "of no broader interest," oh yes it is.
Right. That's like reading Angela Steidl, who uses, when she gets to that part of her book, that's all she's using is the summaries from Phyllis Ramsden. And reading that section of her books, it feels like there's a lot missing out of that entire conversation.
Yes,
so I understand what you're saying.
Well, I think you either have worked directly from the Anne Lister diaries, as Helena and I have, for years and years, Helena starting before me, or you haven't, and you rely upon secondary sources. And the disadvantage of relying on secondary sources, as recent writers like Angela Steidl do, is that you do sound slightly derivative, because what you get when you're right in there, nose to page with Anne Lister and her handwriting crypt, handwriting code, is you get how she lived her life, minute by minute, hour by hour, each day, and it is riveting.
Yes, and yet that's really what the difference between your work and possibly others that had come before you is. You decided as a strategy that you really needed to do that. You needed to look at it, not just the coded sections, but the entire thing. Correct?
Yeah. Other people had either focused on the coded sections, or they'd focused on the handwritten sections or the letters. And I thought, surely to understand Anne Lister, it has to be read it as she wrote it. Yes. And I think what I understand from that, and I hope I've communicated in Female Fortune, is that she was incredibly daring. She managed to do an incredible amount. She dipped in and out of coded sections, for example, the seduction or the wooing and then seduction in the Moss Hut of Anne Walker in around September 1832. But at the same time, she was doing improvements on Shibden, because she'd come back from all these posh southern friends of hers who had grand country, and she came back to shabby little Shibden, and she knew she had to make it look more elegant. And you can just see how she managed to do all the things she managed to do, and how she was a person of such authority and power. And let's just take one tiny little example. Professional men in Halifax, doctors, lawyers, surveyors, they are the main ones. They all depended on Miss Lister for giving them work, and other people. But you couldn't go against Anne Lister if you were a lawyer with any ambition, a doctor with any ambition, a surveyor, etc., with any ambition. She had power, and she knew how to use it.
So she represented, as we call it now, the 1%, that stratosphere of wealth that kind of lived in their own world and were able to do the things that they wanted to do. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, she wasn't a wealthy member of the landed gentry. She sort of slightly had fallen on hard times. Her estate was only 400 acres. And if you compare it with Anne Walker's, which is the one I know best, because you've got reasons, because they were married. They got married in 1834. Anne Walker's estate was bigger. It had more lucrative properties. It was more resplendent, and the Cronest house was more resplendent. So Anne Lister was the smaller landed gentry, but she could still exert power, not least because she was extremely clever.
Yes, very clever. Very clever, but unfortunately had to spend a pretty good portion of her time trying to figure out ways to monetize what she had, to find ways to bring money into the estate. Wasn't sitting back on a pile of money.
Yeah, which she did, particularly opening her coal mines, which I do write about a bit in Female Fortune. But could we just do a little link, is that possible, between Female Fortune and Greenham Common?
Absolutely.
Would that be all right? Because
yes.
Female Fortune came out in 1998 and got some really nice reviews, which if you want to click onto my website, I give little tastes of. And a lot of interest in Anne Lister. And Sally Wainwright, then an emerging scriptwriter, this was a long time ago, before she became rightly celebrated, got to hear about Anne Lister because she'd grown up near here in Sorby Bridge. And so she asked a friend of hers who'd been at school with them together in Sorby Bridge, can you do some research for me on Anne Lister? And Tabitha said, no, I can't, I've got a job. But I know, but through the Greenham Common link, Greenham Common women, I know a woman who's written about it. Here's a present. Was it a birthday present, a Christmas present, a present? I don't know. And she gave Sally Wainwright a copy of Female Fortune. And Sally says she was just riveted. It really inspired her. She was absolutely gripped that here was a town that she thought was deeply boring, as we so often do when we're teenagers. I've got to get away. I must escape, which we all do. And then she was learning about it. And this amazing woman who'd lived there hundreds of years before and had written this riveting diary. So through Tabitha, this mutual friend, I met up with Sally Wainwright. We all had supper in 2001, not too far away in the family home. And I met Sally and we began working together on what would eventually become Gentleman Jack.
Tell me a little bit about that work. What did that consist of? How did the two of you work together?
We were both very enthusiastic, both very committed, both very hardworking. I was trying to help Sally answer Sally's questions and shape my research into a way she wanted. She was wanting to find out more about Anne Lister from 1833 to 36, which is when Female Fortune, the period she covers. So we worked very enthusiastically together. We got inside Cliff Hill, one of the Crow Nest houses where Anne Lister's aunt lived, and we went inside the I think Sally was working on Coronation Street at the time as a sort of jobbing script writer, so she knew somebody from Coronation Street lived in Cliff Hill, so we managed to get her. I'd lived here for years and never got inside Cliff Hill. I was obviously in the wrong occupation, never worked on Coronation Street, hopeless. So we got inside Cliff Hill, which was wonderful. We got inside, and I can't remember quite how, into Christopher Rawson's house, which is in Halifax, which is Hope Hall and resplendent.
Wow.
But although we were enthusiastic, hardworking, committed, it wasn't the right time. I had a full-time job at Leeds and shouldn't really have been walking around Shibden with a scriptwriter. And more importantly, Sally Wainwright wasn't an established, celebrated, award-winning scriptwriter yet. So she went on to write Scott and Bailey, Last Tango in Halifax, and Happy Valley, and became absolutely an established scriptwriter, genius figure. And yes, you asked the question.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm sad I'm really sad that Sally hasn't done, twice that amount, because here during the before the pandemic, we burned through all of Sally Wainwright very quickly. She's such a fabulous writer.
She is absolute genius scriptwriter.
Yes. And so you shared a story with me about Sally had an interesting way of placing you in the panoply of Anne Lister's historians.
Yes. If I remember rightly, she said there was a whole range of ways that editors and historians approach Anne Lister, from the very romantic editors who tend to focus on in the LGBTQ community, sometimes not, on the coded sections and the very romantic stories about Anne Lister, through to other editors and historians, some in the LGBT community, some not, who end up having read the diaries, the handwritten sections and the coded sections, quite critical of Anne Lister. One person says, "What a beast of a woman," or end up really quite critical, and not just her, because of how she treated other people, how they felt she was manipulative. And Sally was kind enough to say, "I think you are balanced, Jill. You stand somewhere in the middle." And I said, "Sally, I love to be balanced. I love to be the historian who sifts the evidence and assesses it and comes to a balanced conclusion."
And I think that's the thing that I love so much about your work. Obviously, I absolutely adore Helena's take on the romantic young Anne Lister. And what I certainly appreciate about your work is more from a sociological point of view of where we place Anne Lister in time and authority, as you say, in her life, how that all fit together. So it's a different take on Anne, and I for one really enjoy it. Have you thought about doing any more work on Anne Lister? Do you have anything else in mind?
I'm thinking, I'm looking with interest at other people's work, and I think it would be, very helpful. I'd love it if somebody else would produce a book, and it will take a long time. And if books still count, if paper still matters, on Female Fortune ends in May 1836. If anybody was to do a fairly full critical edition of the Anne Lister diaries and her other writings from May 1836 through to, say, mid-1839 when she goes to Russia, that would be absolutely fantastic.
It would, wouldn't it? Maybe I can do that in my spare time.
Yes, it needs a lot of dedication.
Yeah. So the last thing that I'd like to say, because we are closing in on our Q&A time, you told me a wonderful story about hearing Sally say something while you were riding along in the car with the radio on.
2014, and I knew Sally was going to be on Desert Island Discs. And for people who don't live in Britain, Desert Island Discs has been going forever, and everybody pretends they don't listen to a famous person choosing 12 records, but they actually do. So my partner and I were going for a walk on Sunday morning, and it involved a car drive, and I did not want to be going through the complex traffic lights of Hebden Bridge while listening to Sally Wainwright on Desert Island Discs. So we paused the car halfway between where we live up the hillside down in Hebden Bridge, paused, and we sat there for half an hour, and I was very intrigued by Sally's interest in Sally's musical choice and autobiography. And then Kirsty Young, the interviewer, said, "So Sally, what books other than the Bible and Shakespeare would you like to take to your desert island with you?" And Sally said, without pausing for a moment, "I'd like to take the entire volumes of Anne Lister's diary. Is that okay?" And Kirsty Young said, "No, it isn't." And Sally Wainwright, without again pausing for a second, said, "Oh, okay, well, I'll take Jill Liddington's Female Fortunes, which is the diaries for the mid-1830s. And my heart literally stopped beating for a few seconds, minutes, because it is the ambition of every single author to be lumped together on a desert island with the Bible and Shakespeare. And it was a wonderful moment. And thank you very much, Sally, for your generosity in that.
That's a wonderful story, Jill. We have our questions coming in now, because we've reached that time of the interview. So just so you know, in the background, Livia Labate she's texting me questions that are coming in on the Facebook feed.
Yeah.
So here's our first one. This is from Renora Siaman. Is there anything that struck you as being different from how Anne presented herself in her letters versus her diaries?
You bet. Absolutely. And I explore this in Presenting the Past, which is yellow, because the first half of it is about the diaries, and the second half is about the work Molly Green did on the Anne Lister diaries letters, of which there are so many. And in the diaries, I think we get a fairly honest picture of how Anne Lister saw herself, wanted to record herself. What you get in the letters to her many correspondents was how she chose to present a public face to her chosen correspondent. So to the poor man who was left managing Shibden Estate when they went off, she and Anne Walker went off to Russia, Moscow, and then the Caucasus, was do this, do that, have you done this, have you done that, how much has so-and-so made? Whereas when she's writing to, say, Lady Stuart at the time of one of the parliamentary elections, dear Lady Stuart, I'm trying to use all my political influence to help your family members, the Honourable Stuart Wortley, etc., be elected to Parliament, our Parliament, that they can become MPs. Of course, her amount of influence was just tiny, but she had to talk up to her influential friends like Lady Stuart. And then within the Walker family, which is Anne Walker and her sister who'd married Captain Sutherland, there is again the face that Anne Lister is choosing to present to Elizabeth Sutherland, and most particularly to Captain Sutherland, who was nobody's fool, that she had Anne Walker's best interests at heart, and anything about Anne Walker's money was really neither here nor there, because she had Anne Walker's best interests at heart. So if you've read the diaries and read books about edited books about the diaries, do please have a look at the letters and that second article in Presenting the Past, where I do try and unpick that. Long answer to a short question, sorry.
No, that's okay. This one is from Mandy Mellor. Why do you think Anne Lister left the note "In God is my hope," which ultimately enabled the cracking of the code?
Because it was in God that her hope lay. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about Anne Lister, we've talked a little bit about her politics and how she and Anne Walker doorstepped people in the blue interest as elections, but we haven't talked about her as a very observant, faithful Christian, member of the Church of England, which is the established church in Britain, in England, I should say, and within that, fairly to the right, the establishment end of that spectrum. And no Sunday went past without Anne Lister either going to church, it would be Halifax Minster, which you know so well, Pat, having spoken in, and or the church nearer Crow Nest in Lightcliffe, or when her aunt was poorly and her aunt had sort of gout in her leg and was bedridden, reading the Sunday service, reading the prayers to the family, I think sort of round her aunt's bed, as it were, and all the servants. She was very, very strongly Christian, strongly Anglican, strongly believing in supporting the established church, the church in danger. And she strongly felt that God had made her the way he wanted to make her, and she should not and deviate from that.
I have a follow-up question to that. I seem to have heard two different things about that. In one story, I've heard that it was a scrap of paper found in the piles of papers in Shibden Hall that had that "In God is my hope." And then just recently, I also heard that it was someplace in her diaries.
Right, let me just quote the tiny little bit in Presenting the Past where I quote it.
Okay.
And this is Burrell's letter to Edward Green in 1937 about he and John Lister being in Shibden trying to crack the code in around 1892. We then examined one of the boxes behind the panels, and halfway down the collection of deeds, Shibden Hall deeds with the tenants, we found a scrap of paper, these words, "In God is my." We at once saw that the word must be hope, and the H and E corresponded with my guess. So I don't think it is the diaries. I think it's a scrap of paper that somehow got into all the estate papers, the deeds of the Shibden Hall, of which there's so much. And it's just a little scrap of paper that happened to get misplaced. That's what I feel, rather than in the diaries. Going on Burrell's evidence.
what I find interesting about that fact is if it had been in the diaries, and this goes back to the idea of whether or not Ann Lister would have wanted her diaries found and read. You can make an argument that if it was in the diaries, no, she would have thought that that particular little bit of code cracking would have been burned with the diaries. But the fact that she left this scrap of paper someplace can open a door to a school of thought that says, no, perhaps she really did want them found at some point. It's a little hard to believe because of some of the stuff that she includes in her diaries, but it's intriguing to me.
Sorry, I missed that last little bit.
I just said it was intriguing to me. So let's move on to the next question. This is from Claire Bullen. What is a memorable Ann Lister anecdote that you've discovered in her diaries?
How long have you got? Would you like to select a topic and I'll see if I can dig up an anecdote? Seriously, are you there? No.
I'm here.
Pat, you just dig up a topic you'd like an interesting anecdote about.
Okay, let's talk about an interesting anecdote.
Don't say Russia, because I haven't really looked at that in any detail.
Yeah, that's fine. We're both struggling. We're both kind of juggling with this one, Jill.
Thermometers.
What about thermometers? Brenda's yelling from across the room, how about thermometers? I'm not really sure what she means by that.
Not sure about that.
Yeah.
What I can say about thermometers is that, and let's just go back to the larger picture, Ann Lister was a scientist.
Yes.
Ann Lister was a scientist. She was, amongst other things, she was a linguist. She could pick up languages like nobody's business. She measured the temperature of the day at the start of every day with absolute regularity. So there was a thermometer sitting outside her window, and that was very important to her, that she could track the weather. And any meteorological historian is at Ann Lister's debt because of her tracking of the weather. So, for example, just to bring in another well-known name, not Jane Austen, but Emily Bronte. Mm-hmm. Emily Bronte, as you probably know, was teaching as a humble school teacher just above Shibden in the freezing winter of 1838-39. She didn't last long up there because it was so cold and probably rather boring. And we know how cold it was for Emily Bronte when she was perhaps thinking about writing Wuthering Heights. Yeah. We know that the temperature was like, because further down the hillside in Shibden, Ann Lister was keeping a record of every single thermometer reading each day, each morning.
Quite interesting. You know, there are people who say that on the Bronte side of things, that Wuthering Heights actually is connected to Shibden Hall and Ann Lister, especially the comment that I've read about Heathcliff is that his gender is never really completely and clearly spelled out. So do you have any, have you ever thought about that at all? Is that something that you have?
I've thought a bit about the Brontes' fascination with Ann Lister, and did get quite involved in the Bronte Society for a while when I was working on an article about Ann Lister and Emily Bronte. And it is intriguing that people really want Ann Lister to have known Emily Bronte.
Yeah.
And I just think, get a grip.
Yeah.
Just understand what social class was like in 1830s West Riding, or indeed anywhere in Britain.
Well
that
said.
The likelihood of an inheritor of Shibden's ancient acres occupying Shibden Hall would give more than a passing and cursory glance to a freezing little school teacher called Emily, what was it? As Emily might have gone on a walk around the outskirts of Shibden Estate is unlikely. Ann Lister had a wonderfully dismissive way with school teachers. Two come to mind. Some poor governess writes to her, have you got any jobs? Because female unemployment was a problem. And she said, no, of course I haven't. Just go away. Very dismissive. And then some poor school master who really needed the job was getting a reference from Ann Lister, and Ann Lister gives him an arithmetical, algebraic puzzle that still has me reeling. And this poor man is going, oh, I think it's, and Anne Lister says, well, you're not up to much, and he's dismissed. I mean, we just have to understand, and I know it's difficult living in a country like America, where you wanted to get away from our class system back then.
Successfully, by the way.
To understand how much the landed interests and people like members of the landed gentry like Anne Lister could exercise power over, say, school teachers, the equivalent of Emily Bronte.
Interesting.
It's sobering.
That's a great answer. Yeah. This one is from Veronique Schultz. Did Anne's reputation extend beyond Halifax? Was she known in London, Paris, Copenhagen? Did the press talk about her?
Did the press talk about her? No, not really, not much. They wouldn't do. Was she known? You bet. One of the things about Anne Lister we haven't talked about is her, or haven't talked about enough, was her magnetic social personality. So she walks into a room, I'm pointing to my door, she walks into a room, and if this was a party, all eyes are focused on Anne Lister. She was a brilliant, dazzling, compelling conversationalist. So if Anne Lister was going anywhere, what she had was this knack of finding out who was really important. And usually she was going, let's say she's going beyond York and Mrs. Norcliffe, she's going beyond London and Lady Stuart, she's going over the Channel to some European country. She will find out, she will have the intelligence, persistence, charm to find out who the ambassador is, male, who his wife is, and whether she can get to know his wife. And that's what she certainly did in Paris. And she paralleled that when she got to Moscow. She just had a knack of getting to know the most important people because she was compelling, dazzling conversationalist.
Yes, she knew how to navigate the world and not just traveling. So we have time for one more question, Jill. This one is from Deb. How do you think Anne Lister was able to successfully navigate her accomplishments as a businesswoman in Halifax against the local misogynistic and homophobic backdrop?
First of all, homophobic. Would they know she was a lesbian? The word wasn't in common use and wasn't in common use till the early 20th century. So I don't think that would be... what was the first part?
Was navigating as a businesswoman.
As a businesswoman, that puts her into a slightly smaller category. There were women who inherited land, often by being widowed, and would inherit from their late husband very large estates and would run them. Anne Lister was more hands-on. In the coal business, I have found one or two women who were active as coal entrepreneurs. Anne was particularly hands-on. I think that's what was unusual about her. She really wanted to know about coal. And any man, and let's just mention the Rawsons here, Jeremiah Rawson, but there were others who thought they could put one over on Anne, were making a bad mistake. And I think Sally brings that out quite clearly in the first series of, the Rawsons trying to get one over on her in terms of where the mines are going and who owes who's what. And she does all this wonderful mental arithmetic fluently in her head. And says, oh no. And then in the diary, it's very clear. She keeps people like the younger Rawsons waiting when they come to visit her at Shibden to talk about coal. She keeps them waiting for usually 10 minutes. 10 minutes is quite good. It just establishes social credibility. And Anne Lister is landed gentry, inherited ancient acres, and the Rawsons, unfortunately, are commerce and business.
And there you have it.
Yes.
Jill, I'd like to say again, first of all, happy birthday to Anne Lister today. And I'm so happy that you could join us on her birthday. How appropriate could that possibly be?
Well, thank you so much, Pat, for some wonderful questions and more particularly wonderful interviews. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I'd just like to say one more time, as I did in the Minster when I first listened to you and Helena, I want to thank you again. You have not only educated us. You have not only entertained us, but you have actively changed people's lives with your work. And that is no small thing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. So with that, thank you, Jill. You and I will talk again soon. And thanks so much for joining us. To everybody who's still out there, I just wanted to once again mention, excuse me, we have rescheduled Ann Lister birthday weekend. It will be April 11th through the 18th in Halifax next year, 2021. As dear Helena Whitbread would say, Dio Volente, God willing. And the other thing that I'd like to say is I want to give once more a tremendous amount of thanks to Steph Galloway and Livia Labate for all the work that they're doing behind us in the background, and also to my other two teammates at Ann Lister birthday weekend, Cheryl McDonald and Jennifer Grant. Just so everyone understands, all of this is volunteer work. Nobody's being paid for this. Since the first moment that we came out with ALBW, we've had such wonderful response from any number of people, many of whom you will meet next year at ALBW, because they'll be doing things like photography and videography and all manner of things. So again, thank you. Thank you for your time now. Tomorrow is our next installment of ALBW Live. We will have who's first up will be Angela Clare she's the collections manager for Calderdale Museums. Her office is actually in Shibden Hall. She's going to be talking about the hall with us, Anne's life in it, etc. She has a video to show us, and we had a fascinating conversation with her during the rehearsal the other day. So if you've ever been to Shibden Hall, you're going to want to see this. And if you've never been to Shibden Hall, you're going to want to see this. And then, of course, tomorrow is the big event, Sally Wainwright and Saran Jones. And while I'm talking about that right now, all my thanks go to Sally Wainwright, because it was Sally reaching out to me in an email saying, would you like me to do a live stream with you since you had to cancel the event? It's horrible that all your hard work has gone to nothing. And so Sally, if you're watching, and I will certainly say that again tomorrow night, thank you so much for your generosity, and as to Saran as well. So thank you all for tuning in. We will hopefully see you tomorrow. And this is Pat Esgate signing off from Ann Lister birthday weekend. Take care, be safe, self-isolate. Good night.